Professor Vaknin Day again, and he is a pioneer of narcissistic abuse and the author of Malignant Self-Love. And I hope this will be translated in Turkish soon. And today we will talk about narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder, and borderline personality disorder, because in society they are confusing these illnesses. First, can we talk about the narcissistic personality disorder and the differences between borderline?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Good morning, Shoshanim. And a warning, this is going to be a long answer because there's a lot to say. You're completely right that there is a huge confusion between borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. And why is this important? Because many victims of narcissistic abuse actually have borderline personality disorder. And many abusers actually have borderline personality disorder, not narcissistic personality disorder. And if you get it wrong as a clinician or as a member of the public or as a victim even, then the whole attitude is wrong and the outcomes are wrong. A proper diagnosis is the precondition for healing, of course, but also for management. To manage a relationship, to manage a therapeutic process, to manage an interpersonal interaction, to manage the workplace, you need to diagnose people correctly. The differences between borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder are not small. They're pretty substantial. So first of all, borderline personality disorder was first described by Adolf Stern in 1938, a long time ago. Oh. He didn't call it borderline personality disorder, he called it the borderline group. So this was Adolf Stern in 1938. Then between the 1930s and the 1980s, there were many studies about borderline personality disorder. It was the heyday of these studies, and so we had people like Otto Kernberg and others, and we had, of course, Kohut on the side of narcissism. And at that point in time, many prominent scholars believed that there is a deep relationship between borderline personality organization, borderline features, borderline traits, borderline behaviors, borderline dynamics, and narcissism. They believe that there is a profound etiological connection. In other words, there's something that leads to both conditions emerging simultaneously. Kernberg suggested that borderline is a defense, narcissism is a defense against borderline. He said initially the person develops borderline and then it's terrifying, and so the person defends against the borderline condition by becoming a narcissist.
Then every narcissist can be also borderline, we can say like this?
Not every narcissist can be borderline, because once you acquire the narcissistic defenses, they take over and they eliminate the borderline.
Okay.
There are, of course, people who are both borderline and narcissists. Of course, there is what we call a comorbidity, borderline and narcissism. It is not 40%, like self-styled experts are saying. There's a lot of nonsense online. One should be very careful. But yeah, there is a comorbidity of this kind. Grotstein, who was another psychoanalyst, suggested that a child who is exposed to abuse and trauma becomes more and more borderline, and then at some point the child says, I cannot tolerate this borderline condition, I want to become a narcissist. And the child attempts to become a narcissist. If this transition from borderline to narcissism fails, the child remains stuck in the borderline phase and will develop borderline personality disorder. If it succeeds, the child will eliminate the borderline, defend against it very efficiently, bury it in the unconscious, and will become a full-fledged narcissistic person. And that's why Grotstein says that the borderline is a failed narcissist, someone who tried to become a narcissist and failed. So this is generally the general overview of the connection between them. But when we look at the clinical picture, when someone comes to a clinic to get some therapy, or when someone needs to be diagnosed. For example, in court settings or in prison, or when someone needs to be has undergone some kind of massive crisis and needs to be diagnosed. What we do, we look at what we call clinical features. We look at behaviors, we look at dynamics, we look at emotions, we look at cognitions, and so on and so forth. And now I will go into the differences between the two conditions. We start with the elements of borderline which exist in all types of borderline. There is no borderline personality disordered patient alive without these features. There are other features which appear in some borderlines and don't appear in other borderlines. But the ones I'm going to describe right now appear in all borderlines. So the first thing is emotional volatility, emotional dysregulation. This is called affective instability. That is when emotions, negative and positive, overwhelm the borderline, disable the borderline. The borderline becomes paralyzed. It's as if the borderline perceives emotions as threatening, and then the borderline freezes. She freezes. And it's a kind of defense against this situation. So all borderlines have this. All borderlines cope very badly with emotions. Emotions disable, paralyze them. The second element, which is common to all borderlines, is mood lability, ups and downs, cycling, and so on. Now, this is not to be confused with bipolar disorder. In bipolar disorder, we also have cycling between depression and mania, or elation, or euphoria. So we have this. But there are massive, big differences between bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. They are not the same condition, as many Europeans, so-called scholars and so-called clinicians, they make this mistake very often. I was in Austria recently, and I'm sorry to say, but the so-called professionals there confuse BPD and bipolar. So this is very serious confusion. Bipolar disorder is a mood disorder, and the difference between bipolar disorder and BPD is that the cycles of depression and mania are much longer in bipolar. They can last months, sometimes years, whereas in borderline personality disorder, the cycles are much faster, and typically they are between 4 hours and 4 days, but never longer. Second difference, the sleep patterns in bipolar disorder are dramatically different to the sleep patterns in borderline. In borderline, the borderline patient finds it very difficult to fall asleep, finds difficult to maintain sleep, has insomnia and so on. Whereas the bipolar patient simply does not want to sleep. Is against sleeping, doesn't want to sleep.
They resist sleeping.
The manic phase, the bipolar resists sleeping, does not want to sleep. And in the depressive phase of bipolar disorder, the patient is hypersomniac. In other words, this kind of patient sleeps 20 hours a day. That is in bipolar, not in borderline. In borderline, there's a constant state of sleep dysfunction, constant state of insomnia, or the sleep is always disturbed in the same way. So mood lability. Next thing is the intensity of the interpersonal relationships. Here is a major source of confusion. Both the borderline and the narcissist idealize, overvalue, and then devalue. Both of them.
The same cycle.
Same cycle, identical. The interpersonal pattern of relationship in borderline is indistinguishable, totally identical to the pattern of relationship in narcissism. They cannot be told apart. However, what is different is the intensity. Whereas in narcissism, the shared fantasy that dictates the cycle of the relationship is very robotic, very automatic. It's as if the narcissist is going through the motions is not really in it, is not really involved in it. It's like acting. It's like going through, okay, phase 2, okay, phase 3. What can I do? You know, I have to go through it. It's as if the narcissist is one step removed from the relationship. He's like observing maybe the relationship. Or, so you could see in narcissism a pattern of detachment. Whereas in borderline, the relationship is super intense. The intensity is enormous. It's fire, it's brimstone, it's uncontrollable, it's dramatic, super dramatic. So this is common to borderline, actually, not to narcissists. And the intensity is a differentiating feature between narcissism and borderline. But in this relational disorder, this is called relational disorder. In this relational disorder, the borderline also starts by love bombing, devaluing, idealizing, and then devaluing the partner. In this sense, it's the same. The splitting defense in borderline is the same as a splitting defense in narcissism. So that's what allows the borderline to idealize. You're all good, you can do no wrong, you're perfect, you're amazing, you're unprecedented, I've never had anyone like you, and so on. And then immediately transition to, I hate you, you're horrible, everything you do is wrong.
And they're all real emotions at that time.
All this is perceived as authentic or ego, not ego alien, ego congruent. So the borderline perceives all this as real, coming from the inside, and so on and so forth. But in her case, in the case of the borderline, it's much more, as I said, dramatic and intense than in the case of the narcissist. And this is why it's very difficult for victims of narcissistic abuse, because the narcissist treats you, when you're the intimate partner, treats you as kind of object. You're objectified, kind of. Yes, he will love bomb you and idealize you, but you always have a feeling that it's not really about you. The idealization in the case of narcissism is about the narcissist and about the process. The narcissist is like invested in the process, not in you. It could be anyone. There's a feeling that it could have been anyone. It didn't have to be me as the intimate partner, but it could have been anyone.
Yes.
And very often victims of narcissistic abuse discover that the narcissist repeats the same pattern with the same behaviors, with the same sentences, with the same words, with multiple potentials, sometimes at the same time. At the same time. Because there's no attachment, there's no what we call cathexis, there's no emotional investment. Whereas in borderline, the emotional investment, the cathexis is very clear, very powerful, overwhelming, consuming. The drama is operatic, you know, like opera. It's a production, some major production, and so on and so forth. In borderline, we have something that we don't have in narcissism, and that is what we call the twin anxieties. We have a combination of abandonment anxiety. By the way, abandonment anxiety or separation anxiety is not the clinical term. The clinical term is separation insecurity. So we have abandonment anxiety on the one hand, and we have engulfment anxiety. So what happens with the borderline, she seeks intimacy. She wants love. I say she, let it be clear, half of all borderlines are men, and half of all narcissists are women. But I'm using she because of historical reasons. Yeah. So the borderline would look for love, for intimacy, for immersion, for merger, for fusion, for symbiosis, a twin flame, a soulmate, you know, a reflection, a copy, a clone. She would look for something like that. And then she would approach, and she would experience this reaction from the partner. And if the partner reciprocates, provides this intimacy, affords this love, the borderline panics. She panics. She feels suffocated. She feels shackled, imprisoned. She feels she's dying. And then she runs away. Avoidance. So we call it approach, avoidance, repetition, compulsion. Because it's compulsive. She cannot help it. So the borderline, on the one hand, has severe abandonment anxiety. She's terrified of rejection, of being ignored, of criticism, or exactly like the narcissist in this sense. But she has something the narcissist does not have. engulfment anxiety. And consequently, she cycles. And so this is the famous, I hate you, don't leave me. I hate you, don't leave me. Yeah.
When the relation is very good and very nice, then one type of anxiety starts. When the relation is going bad, another type of anxiety
yes, she's
starts.
always
in anxiety.
Always. Anxiety is the background noise of borderline. The borderline is constantly anxious. She anticipates rejection, humiliation, abandonment, and she panics. And then she behaves in ways that cause the abandonment, because she becomes clinging, or she becomes aggressive, or she becomes demanding. But if this doesn't happen, if she has no reason to anticipate rejection and abandonment because the partner is in love, and you know, then she panics, because that means she's going to disappear. Borderline is about merger, about fusing with the partner, becoming one with the partner, like going back to the womb. It's symbiotic. It's creating a single organism with two heads. And this is a terrifying experience because it means that she has to disappear. The borderline hands over, outsources her mind to the intimate partner. She tells the intimate partner, from this moment on, you have perfect control over me. You can regulate my moods. You can make me happy, you can make me depressed. I'm giving you this power. You can regulate my emotions. A smile from you would change my emotions. If you criticize me, you can change my emotions. So you have total power over me. She hands over agency, total power. And that, of course, creates panic. Because if someone is in total control of you, total ownership of you, if someone is your master, that means you're the slave. Means you're a slave. And that is a terrifying thought, because what if the partner suddenly loses interest or abandons you? What if the partner is evil and is going to abuse this access and this power and torture the borderline? There are all kinds of scenarios. The borderline has enormous imagination. So there's all kinds of scenarios. And she panics and she runs away. She destroys, she undermines the relationship, she sabotages the relationship in a variety of ways. She could cheat, she could engage in infidelity, she could triangulate. Triangulation means you introduce a third party into the relationship and in order to provoke the intimate partner. She could literally undermine and sabotage the goals of the intimate partner. She could even place the intimate partner in at risk by, I don't know, going to the police or to the tax authorities and snitching on the partner. There's no end to what she can do.
Then she can give harm to the person also.
One way to get rid of the one way to get rid of the relationship is to get rid of a partner.
It's a border.
When you get rid of a partner, there's no relationship. It is the relationship that threatens the borderline. Another thing in borderline, which is less common in narcissism, is anger. Not necessarily rage, but anger. With narcissism, we have narcissistic rage. But narcissistic rage is reactive. If you disagree with the narcissist, criticize the narcissist, humiliate the narcissist, and so on and so forth, the reaction might be, not always, narcissistic rage. In borderline, the background is anger. Like anxiety, exactly like anxiety, the anger is always there, very close to the surface. It's very easy to provoke the borderline. And she is constantly angry. And this anger manifests in outbursts, but she can also be passive-aggressive, or she can be angry as a state of mind. She could be constantly angry. It's an angry person. You know, anger is a crucial element in borderline. It's inappropriate and it's uncontrolled, and it defines the borderline. And finally, another psychological feature of all borderlines. So everything I just described is common and valid for all borderlines.
Basic borderline.
All types, yes. These are the clinical features which are common to all borderlines. So, and the last one is emptiness. The borderline feels empty inside. She feels a void. She feels like she is a black hole. And she has to fulfill this emptiness somehow. So some of them fulfill the emptiness with theatrics and dramatics. Some of them fulfill the hope hope to fulfill the emptiness via the intimate partner. This kind of borderline might say, you are my world, you are my life, I'm living for you, you know. The borderline develops a multiplicity of techniques to cope with the emptiness and to fulfill it somehow. Because the alternative is to experience the emptiness, which leads usually to self-harm, self-mutilation, cutting, and so on, and suicidal ideation. Depending on the population of borderlines, between 3% and 11% of borderlines die of suicide. Oh. That's a huge number. It means that 1 of every 10 borderlines would end his or her life. And that is the leading cause of death among borderlines. Suicide. Not cancer, not heart attack, but suicide. Okay. So these are the core features of borderline. Now let's talk about other clinical features which are common, but you could be a borderline without them. These clinical features. You could be diagnosed with borderline and not have these features. You cannot be diagnosed with borderline unless you have the features that I mentioned until now. These are minimum requirements to be diagnosed. But now there's many others, and we'll talk about them. Again, I will compare all the time to narcissists. Yes. Okay. Number 1 is identity disturbance or identity diffusion. The borderline's identity is not stable. So on Monday, she has some values, she has some beliefs, she's committed to a certain course of action, she has plans for her life, she has attitudes, she has motivations. That's on Monday. On Wednesday, she will be the exact opposite than Monday. So on Monday she could say, people who cheat on their spouses should be executed. I hate cheating. There's nothing worse than infidelity. Then on Wednesday she will go to a bar, she will pick up a stranger and she will cheat with him. So that's an example of what we call axiological shift in values. But also beliefs. She can say on Monday, I believe in God. Definitely God is managing my life. I find solace and comfort in God, and so on. And then on Wednesday, she will espouse the most extreme form of atheism, and so on. So there's no stability, not in values, not in beliefs, not in attitudes, not in motivations. Of course, her plans change all the time. On Monday, she wants to go to study agriculture. On Wednesday, she decided to be a mathematician. And on Friday, she would be a traditional wife and housewife. Of course, until next Monday, when she would want to become an astronaut. Yeah?
Are they aware of these shiftings?
Not really, because one major problem with borderline, and that is opposed to what people believe, is that borderlines are egosyntonic. In other words, borderlines feel comfortable with who they are. Now that's very important distinction. A borderline might feel guilty or ashamed for what she had done. She might also feel distressed, disappointed and angry because of the consequences of her actions, the outcomes. But when it comes to herself, she feels good with who she is. She's egosyntonic. She actually is grandiose. Borderlines are grandiose, exactly like narcissists. So she would regard herself as superior in some way. Super beautiful, drop dead gorgeous. She's gorgeous and you drop dead. You know, all kinds of, she would aggrandize herself in her own mind, and so she is egosyntonic. And in her mind, these shifts in identity, these cataclysmic transitions, are fully justified. She would say, for example, yeah, I wanted to study agriculture on Monday, but then I did some search online and there's no future in this. So that's why now I want to be an astronaut. Because I think astronauts will go to Mars with Elon Musk, and so I want, you know, this kind of thing. She would invent some stupid.
They can find excuses very easily.
Yeah, some story. Okay. So identity diffusion or identity disturbance is pretty common in borderlines, but not in all. Next is dissociation. More extreme borderlines where the personality organization is seriously disturbed, where actually the personality is not put together at all. It's kaleidoscopic, broken, shattered fragments. You know, this kind of borderline, the extreme end of the spectrum, would usually have dissociation. She would dissociate when she finds herself in a situation of stress or extreme anxiety. For example, when she anticipates rejection or humiliation, or experiences abandonment, or in these conditions, she falls apart. She goes through a process called decompensation. All the defenses crumble or are disabled, and she remains without a skin. It's like she doesn't have a skin. She's in direct touch with reality and has no defense, no firewall, nothing. At that point, she has essentially only one option. She acts out. She externalizes aggression in some way. There's a lot of aggression, anger that is boiling and building and so on. There's a lot of fear, anxiety. And so to somehow get rid of these emotions, she would act out. She would do something crazy. But because whatever she is about to do is socially unacceptable and she hates some of her actions, she would later feel bad, guilty, ashamed. She knows it. So she would do it and forget about it. But I mean forget. Not really forget. She's not pretending. She simply is not there. So we have three types of dissociation in borderline. We have amnesia, simply forgetting what happened. So she could sleep with a stranger, you know, on a one-night stand, and she would not remember it. Even when she's confronted with evidence and so on, she would be shocked. She would not have no recollection of the event. Even when she's not drunk. She could derealize. Derealization is when she does something, but it feels like a movie. It feels unreal. And depersonalization is when she does something, but she feels that she is not there. So her body is there, and someone is penetrating her or doing something to the body. She has left her body. She is not there. So these are all forms of dissociation. And dissociation is common in more extreme cases. Similarly, in more extreme cases, we have a very dangerous process actually, which is paranoid ideation. More extreme borderlines become paranoid easily. And then when they become paranoid, and because borderline is a disorder of aggression, when they become paranoid, they become positively dangerous, absolutely dangerous. If the borderline identifies you as a threat, she may wish to take you out somehow, poison you, kill you, do something, you know, just to reduce the anxiety. So externalized aggression in extreme borderline is anxiolytic. It reduces anxiety. None of the things I described applies to narcissism. Narcissists don't have identity diffusion, at least not in the borderline way. They don't dissociate. Narcissists don't dissociate only under stress, like borderline. They dissociate all the time. Narcissists have paranoid ideation, but only when they collapse. The paranoia is a form of grandiosity. I'm important. People are conspiring against me. People have malevolent intentions because I'm very crucial, I'm very superior. People envy me, so they want to. So this is the narcissism type of paranoia. But in narcissism, paranoid ideation is pretty limited to the collapse, and is never aggressive. Paranoia would not lead the narcissist to act against anyone. You know? And so the differences are very important. Next is the fact that both narcissists and borderlines have a false self. This is something that people don't know. They think only narcissists have a false self. It's not true. The borderline also has a false self. And similarly, the borderline is grandiose, exactly like the narcissist. And similarly, she has a fantasy, exactly like the narcissist. So what's the difference? These are critical features in narcissism. And if the borderline has all of them, maybe it's true that borderlines are narcissists. The answer is no, because the content of the false self and the content of the fantasy and the content of the grandiosity are very, very different
their fantasies
to narcissism. Yes. Whereas in narcissism, the fantasy is about the narcissist. the grandiosity of the narcissist, the fantasy in narcissism is what we call self-enhancing. It's a fantasy that makes the narcissist bigger in some way, more intelligent, more. So a narcissist could have a fantasy that he's a genius. That would be a classical cerebral narcissist fantasy. Or a narcissist could have a fantasy that is sexually irresistible. That's also a typical narcissistic fantasy. But the fantasy is about self-enhancing, the cognitive distortion, the grandiose narrative, the grandiose self-concept of the narcissist, which is inflated and unrealistic and counterfactual. In borderline, the fantasy is about the partner, not about herself. The fantasy is not a reimagining of the borderline. It's not about the borderline. The typical fantasy of the borderline, I found him. I found the one. He is going to be my rock. Now someone knows me like no one else. Someone can therefore, because he knows me and loves me, because of course it's all dramatic, the love is intense and amazing and never before, and so on. So now this person will be able to reach into my mind and regulate my emotions, stabilize my moods, and generally make me harmonious, in harmony, make me feel at peace with myself, inner peace, reduce my anxiety, take away my anxiety. I will not be anxious anymore. Wonderful. I found instant therapy in the intimate partner. So the borderline's fantasy is exteriorized. It's a fantasy about someone else.
Can they fall in love very easily? The narcissist can change their supply very easily. Can borderline do that too?
Yes, but both narcissists and borderlines don't love.
Yeah.
This is not love, of course.
It's their fantasy.
It's fantasy.
But as you said, she thinks that she found the one, then she can find too many ones.
Yes, she can. The difference between borderline and narcissist is the discard phase. Whereas the narcissist discards offhandedly, instantaneously, and without any visible emotion. Just discards, like so much trash. You're no longer useful, or you contradicted the shared fantasy, or you criticized the narcissist, or you deviated, diverged from the internal object that represents you in the narcissist's mind, and so on. So you're all bad, you're devalued, narcissist splits you, you're all bad, and as an all bad, corrupt object, the narcissist throws you to the garbage, the same way he would throw to the garbage a battery that is finished, or a smartphone that's no longer working. So the discard in narcissism is callous, is cruel, is cold, is calculated, objectifies the discarded person, and so on. Whereas the borderline does not do it this way. The borderline approaches and avoids, and she would do it many, many times before she gives up on the partner. She would approach the partner and run away and come back and try again, and she doesn't give up on the partner very easily. Once she has given up on the partner, she immediately finds an alternative, exactly like the narcissist.
First they find someone and jump to another one.
Not always.
They can give time.
Sometimes yes, sometimes